Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein sat across from an American interrogator in the summer of 1945 and described the worst day of his professional life. He had commanded the Panzer Lehr Division in Normandy, one of the finest armoured formations the Wehrmacht had ever fielded, and on July 25, 1944, that division ceased to exist as a fighting force. The bombers came first. Bayerlein told his interrogator that the aircraft arrived as if on a conveyor belt, that carpets of high explosive rolled back and forth across his positions, that tanks were overturned and buried beneath earth, that infantry positions were flattened and gone. He described vehicles burning in their revetments, communications, trenches collapsed, command posts buried under rubble that had been solid structures minutes earlier. The passage runs to several pages in his post-war manuscript. The language does not soften. But what Bayerlein said next is the passage that American artillerymen have returned to for 80 years. Simultaneously with the storm from the air, he recorded, innumerable guns of American artillery poured drumfire into his positions. Over 70% of his soldiers were dead, wounded, crazed, or dazed by the time it ended. He broke the figures down with the precision of a man who had spent his career reading casualty reports. Roughly 50% of the destruction he attributed to the bombing. Roughly 30% he attributed to the artillery. The remaining 20% he attributed to other causes, small arms, vehicles lost in flight, men who simply broke and could not function. Those proportions are worth sitting with. The heaviest tactical bombing mission of the entire Normandy campaign, more than 4,000 tons dropped by 1,500 heavy and medium aircraft in a single morning, accounted for half the destruction of Panzer Lehr. American artillery, firing from positions the Germans could not see and in many cases could not even locate on a situation map, accounted for nearly a third, and Bayerlein described the two experiences in different language. The bombers he spoke of with the resignation of a man recounting a natural catastrophe, something enormous and impersonal that fell from the sky. The artillery he described with something closer to bewilderment. The artillery knew where his batteries were. It knew where his command posts stood. It found his vehicles on the roads and his guns in their pits, and it killed them with a speed and coordination that nothing in his experience on the Eastern Front, in North Africa, or in France before the breakout had prepared him for. That is the question this record answers, not what the American artillery fired at Cobra or how many rounds it expended. The question is how the American artillery knew where to fire, because the answer was not a piece of technology that the German command would have recognized as dangerous. The answer was an airplane that weighed 1,100 pounds fully loaded, flew slower than a German staff car on a decent road, carried no weapons of any kind, and cost the United States Army $2,400 in 1942 procurement pricing. It was the Piper L-4 Grasshopper, the military variant of the most common civilian flying club trainer in America, and by the autumn of 1944, German artillery crews on the Western Front feared the sound of its small engine more than they feared the roar of a P-47 on a strafing run. When the Grasshopper appeared overhead, German batteries stopped firing. Not because they had received an order from a higher headquarters, because they had learned, through the accumulated experience of battery after battery destroyed, what happened when they did not. If this kind of record matters to you, the like button is what keeps it surfacing to people who care about the actual archive, not the legend. The man whose testimony frames this story was not a rear echelon staff officer speculating about what had happened to someone else's command. Fritz Bayerlein had spent the war at the leading edge of German armoured warfare across multiple fronts. He entered the pre-war Reichswehr as an infantry officer, transferred to the emerging Panzer Arm, and by 1941 had been assigned to North Africa as Chief of Staff of the Afrika Korps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. He was Rommel's primary operational planning officer through the campaigns across Libya and Egypt, through the capture of Tobruk in June 1942, through the Battle of El Alamein in the autumn of that year, through the long fighting retreat to Tunisia. He watched the American army enter the North African War at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, where the initial American performance was disorganized enough to confirm the assumptions the German officer corps held about the combat readiness of the United States Army. He also watched, with the professional attention of a staff officer whose job was to evaluate the enemy, what happened in the months that followed. The same American force that had stumbled at Kasserine reorganized, replaced its commanders, retrained its units, and came back in the spring with a combined arms coordination that had not been visible 2 months earlier. Bayerlein noted the change. He would have cause to remember it. After North Africa, Bayerlein transferred briefly to the Eastern Front, then returned west. In January 1944, he received the command that would define the rest of his war and the rest of his life. The Panzer Lehr Division was not a standard formation. The name tells the story. Lehr means demonstration or instruction in German. The division was built from the armor training schools of the German army, staffed with instructors and combat-experienced cadre, equipped with a higher proportion of Panther tanks and late-model Panzer IVs than any line division in the German order of battle. Its personnel were hand-selected. Its equipment was the best available. When Bayerlein took Panzer Lehr into Normandy after the Allied landings on June 6, 1944, he commanded what was arguably the single best-equipped armoured division the Wehrmacht had anywhere on any front. It made no difference. By the end of July, Panzer Lehr had been ground to pieces under a combination of bombing and artillery fire that Bayerlein had not thought possible in a single engagement. His post-war testimony about the experience was prepared as part of the United States Army Historical Division's Foreign Military Studies program, a systematic effort to debrief captured German officers and have them write detailed accounts of their wartime operations. Bayerlein's manuscripts are designated a 902 and a 903 in the program's catalogue. They were prepared at Allendorf, one of the sites where the program operated, under American supervision between 1946 and 1948. They run to dozens of single-spaced pages. They are held today in the National Archives at College Park, Maryland, in Record Group 549, Records of Headquarters, United States Army, Europe, Historical Division. They have been cited by every major historian of the Normandy campaign, including Rick Atkinson, Carlo D'Este, and Martin Blumenson. Bayerlein's final judgment on what he experienced at Cobra, recorded in the same manuscripts, was that for him, who during this war was committed at the points of main effort in every theatre, this was the worst he had ever seen. The airplane that gave the American artillery its eyes was, by any conventional military standard, an absurd machine of war. The L-4 Grasshopper was the military version of the Piper J-3 Cub, a tandem two-seat light airplane designed before the war for civilian pilot training. Its fuselage was a cage of welded steel tubing covered in doped fabric. Its wings had wooden spars, also fabric-covered. Its landing gear was fixed, with a tailwheel. Its engine was a Continental A65, a flat-4 air-cooled motor that produced 65 horsepower, roughly the output of a large outboard boat motor. It cruised at 75 miles per hour. It stalled at 38. A man on a fast motorcycle could keep up with it on a straight road. Its service ceiling was around 12,000 feet, but in combat it operated between 500 and 1,500 feet, low enough for the observer to read markings on vehicles and count men in a trench. The military variant differed from the civilian Cub in one significant respect. The rear cabin was redesigned with extended plexiglass panels, a configuration that pilots and observers called the greenhouse, which gave the man in the back seat an unobstructed view of the ground below and to both sides. That man was usually a lieutenant. He carried a pair of field binoculars, a mapboard strapped to his knee, and a 25-pound SCR 610 FM radio. The radio was the component that mattered. Everything else, the wings, the engine, the fabric, the wooden spars, was packaging. The radio was the weapon. It connected the observer directly to a battalion fire direction center on the ground, and the fire direction center was the American innovation that separated the United States artillery system from every other artillery system in the Second World War. The fire direction center was a small team of officers and trained enlisted men operating at the battalion level. Their job was to receive a target coordinate from any observation source, whether a man on the ground with a radio, a telephone, or a man in the air, compute the ballistic firing solution for every battery within range, and issue fire commands timed so that all shells from all participating batteries arrived on the target within a window of roughly 3 seconds. The technique was called time on target. It had been developed in American artillery doctrine during the interwar period, and refined through combat experience in North Africa and Italy into a routine capability that no other army could replicate. The math behind time on target was simple in concept and demanding in execution. Shells from guns at different distances travel different times. A 105mm howitzer 4 miles from the target fires a shell that arrives in a different number of seconds than a 155mm gun 7 miles away. The Fire Direction Center computed the exact moment each battery needed to fire, so that every round, from every gun, at every range, arrived at the aim point simultaneously. There was no ranging shot to warn the target. There was no pause between the first impact and the second. Everything arrived at once. The first indication the target had that it was under fire was the detonation. A single observer in an L-4 could call a single grid coordinate into his radio and, through the Fire Direction Center, trigger a coordinated barrage from 6 artillery battalions, or 10, or in a corps-level mission as many as 20. Edgar F. Raines, Jr., in his 2000 study Eyes of the Artillery, published by the United States Army Center of Military History as the official account of Army aviation in the Second World War, calculated the result. A single L-4, directing the massed firepower of an entire American division's artillery, could bring a greater weight of explosives to bear on a target than any other aircraft of the period. With the sole exception of the B-29 carrying an atomic weapon, no airplane in any air force in the world delivered more destructive power per sortie than a 65-horsepower Piper Cub connected to a functioning fire direction center. The German artillery had nothing comparable. German forward observers adjusted fire from ground positions, reliant on telephone wire that American shell fire cut every day and limited to line-of-sight observation across terrain that was often flat, wooded, or obscured by hedgerows. The Germans operated their own observation aircraft, the Fieseler Storch, a well-designed, short takeoff machine, but they did not have the centralized fire direction architecture that allowed one aerial observer to mass the fires of multiple battalions with a single radio call. A German battery commander could direct his own 4 or 6 guns. He could not, with one transmission, synchronize 48 guns from 4 separate battalions, firing from 4 separate locations, to place their shells on one grid square within 3 seconds. The Americans did this routinely by the time they reached Normandy. The L-4 was the eye that made the entire architecture lethal. The combat history of the L-4 begins with one of the worst operational debuts of any weapons system in the European War. On November 9, 1942, during Operation Torch, 3 Grasshoppers launched from the flight deck of the carrier USS Ranger off the coast of French Morocco to support the landings at Fedhala. They were the first American artillery observation aircraft to fly in combat. The cruiser USS Brooklyn, operating offshore in support of the landing force, opened fire on the first Cub because her aircraft recognition manual did not include an L-4 silhouette. The ship's anti-aircraft gunners had never seen the type and assumed it was hostile. The pilot, Captain Ford Alcorn, was struck 5 times in the leg by friendly naval gunfire and crash-landed on the beach. The second Grasshopper went down behind Vichy French lines, its crew briefly captured before Allied forces overran the area. The third was driven to the ground by fire from American landing craft whose gunners, like the men on Brooklyn, could not identify it. 3 aircraft launched, 3 aircraft down, not a single artillery mission completed. The recovery from that disaster was one of the fastest tactical adaptations of the entire war. By the spring of 1943 in Tunisia, the L-4 had become the standard means of adjusting American artillery fire. The friendly fire problem was addressed through recognition training, distinctive markings, and the simple distribution of aircraft identification cards that should have been in the fleet's recognition books from the beginning. The radio link between observer and fire direction center was refined through field experience. Pilots, who were artillery officers by training and aviators by a roughly 60-day volunteer flight course completed at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, learned to read the ground from 1,000 feet with the practiced eye of men who understood where shells landed and what they did when they arrived. By the time the campaign moved to Sicily in July 1943, and then to mainland Italy that September, the air observation post had matured from an experiment into an indispensable arm of the American ground force. Italy is where the L-4 became the aircraft that German artillerymen had to plan around. The Italian peninsula, with its narrow coastal plains, mountainous spine, and dense concentrations of opposing artillery at beachheads and river crossings, was the proving ground. At Anzio, in the early months of 1944, the compressed beachhead perimeter placed American and German artillery within close range of each other, and the L-4s operated over the most concentrated artillery environment in the Mediterranean theatre. Captain William H. Mackay of the 5th Army Air Section, flying an observation mission over German assembly areas south of the perimeter, spotted a counterattack force of 2,400 German troops forming in the open. Mackay transmitted the coordinates to his fire direction center. 5,000 rounds of American artillery fell on the German formation before it could advance. A German officer captured in the aftermath of the barrage told his American interrogators that casualties from that single concentration exceeded 50%. The account is documented in Edgar Raines's Eyes of the Artillery at page 166, sourced from the operational files of the 5th Army Air Section. At the same beachhead, Captain John W. Oswalt of the 1st Armored Division Air Section demonstrated what the system could accomplish at full scale. Oswalt directed the combined fires of 370 artillery pieces, along with naval gunfire from the cruiser USS Brooklyn, the light cruiser HMS Dido, and the light cruiser HMS Orion, onto a single target set from his L-4 cockpit. 370 guns and 3 warships coordinated by one man in an airplane that weighed half a ton. The German ground commanders at Anzio, watching what the Cubs were doing to their units, sent urgent requests to the Luftwaffe to prioritize the destruction of American observation aircraft. The requests were answered with little effect. By the time a Messerschmitt or Fokker-Wulf could be vectored to an L-4's last reported position, the Cub had moved. It could turn inside any fighter the Germans had. It could descend to treetop level. It could land in a vineyard, a cow pasture, a stretch of secondary road, shut down its engine, and disappear under a tree. And shooting at it from the ground with flak or small arms produced exactly the outcome German batteries were trying to avoid. Muzzle flashes visible from 1,000 feet, a grid coordinate radioed to the fire direction center in seconds, shells arriving in minutes, and so the guns went quiet. The pattern that emerged in Italy and hardened into standing practice through Normandy was straightforward. When L-4s were overhead, German batteries sat in their pits with loaded tubes and visible targets and did not fire, because firing meant dying. The cost of that silence to the German war effort is difficult to quantify but easy to understand. An artillery battery that does not fire is not an artillery battery. It is a collection of expensive steel tubes served by trained crews who are consuming rations, occupying defensive positions, and contributing nothing to the fight. Every hour that German batteries spent waiting for a Cub to leave was an hour that the German infantry had to fight without the fire support it was counting on. Every attack that was launched without a proper artillery preparation because the observation aircraft were overhead was an attack that was weaker than it should have been. Every defensive position that could not call for supporting fires from neighboring batteries because a Grasshopper was circling at 1,000 feet was a position that had to hold on small arms alone. The L-4 did not kill German artillerymen by the thousands. It neutralized them. It turned entire battalions of heavy guns into silent spectators, and it did so with an airplane that a factory in central Pennsylvania was producing at the rate of several per day. The scale of the L-4's contribution in Normandy and the subsequent breakout was enormous. Raines documented that from D-Day, June 6, 1944, through the German surrender in May 1945, air observation posts conducted 97% of all artillery adjustment missions in the European theatre of operations. 97%. Almost every American artillery round that was adjusted onto a specific German target in Western Europe was adjusted by a man in a Piper Cub. In June and July of 1944 alone, First Army under General Omar Bradley lost 49 artillery spotting aircraft and 33 pilots to all causes, figures recorded in Raines and cited by Smithsonian Air and Space magazine. Those losses were significant but replaceable. The Grasshopper cost less than $2,500. Piper's factory at Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, was producing them faster than combat could consume them. Over the course of the war, More than 5,600 L-4s and the closely related L-14 variant were accepted by the Army Air Forces. More than 2,700 served in Europe. Roughly 900 were lost to combat, accidents, and operational wear. The Cobra bombardment that destroyed Bayerlein's Panzer Lehr on July 25 was the most dramatic demonstration of the system the Cubs fed. Martin Blumenson, in his official United States Army History Breakout and Pursuit, published by the Center of Military History in 1961, recorded that non-divisional artillery under 7th Corps control for the Cobra preparation numbered 258 pieces, and the Corps had been allocated nearly 140,000 rounds of ammunition. That weight of fire, adjusted and directed by the L-4 network, would have destroyed Panzer Lehr even without the bomber support. The bombers made the destruction total, the artillery made it precise. Bayerlein himself said the artillery found specific positions, command posts, gun pits, vehicle parks, in a way the carpet bombing could not. The bombs fell on a grid. The guns fired at a point. Bayerlein knew the difference. After the breakout, the L-4 network moved with the advancing American columns, and the way it operated in the field tells the story of how deeply it was embedded in the ground force. Each American infantry, armored or airborne division in the European theater was authorized approximately a dozen Grasshoppers, with 2 assigned to each field artillery battalion. The pilots and observers were not Air Corps officers. They were artillery officers who had volunteered for flight training. They wore the crossed cannon insignia of the field artillery, not wings. They answered to the division artillery commander, not to an air headquarters. Their airstrips were not airfields. They were pastures, stretches of road, clearings hacked out of Norman hedgerows, any flat surface long enough for an airplane that needed less than 300 feet to get off the ground and could land in even less. When an armored column advanced, the L-4s leapfrogged with it, landing on the next available road, shutting down long enough to refuel from 5-gallon cans carried on a jeep and taking off again to scout ahead. Major General John S. T. Pleast, Wood of the 4th Armored Division, used his L-4s not only for artillery observation, but for personal command reconnaissance, flying over the route of advance to identify where the Germans were setting up their next defensive line before his tanks ran into it. That intimacy between the air section and the ground force was something the Luftwaffe's own observation units had never achieved on the same scale. German observation pilots reported to a separate Air Force chain of command. Their reports passed through Luftwaffe channels before reaching the Army units that needed them. The American system cut out the intermediary. The man in the L-4 worked for the same artillery commander whose guns he was directing. He knew the Fire Direction Center crew by name. He understood what the battery commanders needed because he had trained alongside them. The result was a speed of response that German officers noticed even when they did not understand the organizational structure behind it. The most vivid individual combat story from the L-4 cockpit belongs to Major Charles Carpenter of the 4th Armored Division Artillery Air Section. Carpenter was a high school history teacher from Urbana, Illinois, before the war, not a career military pilot or an adventurer by temperament. He had volunteered for the artillery, then volunteered again for the aerial observer course at Fort Sill, and by the summer of 1944, he was flying an L-4 over the vanguard of George Patton's Third Army racing across France. What set Carpenter apart from every other L-4 pilot in the theater was what he did to his airplane. He bolted 6 M1A1 bazooka rocket launchers to the wing struts of his L-4H, 3 on each side, and wired them to toggle switches he could reach from the cockpit. The aircraft, serial number 4330426, manufacturer serial number 11717, accepted in April 1944, was painted with the name Rosie the Rocketer on its fuselage. On September 20, 1944, near Aracourt in Lorraine, fog initially screened a German armoured counterattack by the 111th Panzer Brigade against Combat Command A of the 4th Armoured Division. As the fog cleared through the morning, Carpenter flew 3 sorties against the advancing Panthers, firing at least 16 bazooka rockets at ranges close enough to see the crews. He was credited with immobilizing 2 Panther tanks and several armored vehicles that day. Over the course of the Lorraine campaign and into the winter, Carpenter was officially credited with 6 tanks destroyed, including 2 reported as Tigers, and he received the Silver Star, the Bronze Star with oak leaf cluster, and the Air Medal with oak leaf cluster. What Carpenter told a Stars and Stripes reporter after one of his missions, in a dispatch published in the first half of October 1944 and reprinted in papers including the Deseret News and the Indiana Gazette, is the most revealing period statement about the German response to the Grasshopper. "Word must be getting around among those krauts," Carpenter said, "to watch out for cubs with bazookas on them. Every time he showed up now, they shot at him with everything they had. They never used to bother cubs. 6 words from a schoolteacher in a cockpit, and they tell the whole story. Those last 6 words confirm the operational reality from the field." Before Carpenter turned the L-4 into an attack platform, German troops had learned that engaging an unarmed observation plane was not worth the price of revealing their position. Silence was survival. Carpenter's bazookas disrupted that calculation, because now the Cub itself was a direct threat, but until he and a small number of other improvising pilots broke the pattern, the standard German response to an L-4 overhead was to go still and wait. The system continued to produce devastating results through the final campaigns of the war. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, the value of the L-4 network was demonstrated by what happened when it could not fly. The German offensive launched on December 16 under conditions of low cloud, fog, and snow that grounded most Allied aircraft for the first several days. Without aerial observation, American artillery was forced to rely on ground observers whose view was limited by terrain and weather. The difference in effectiveness was immediate and measurable. German units that had been unable to move in daylight for months advanced through the first days of the offensive with a freedom of maneuver that their commanders had not experienced since before the Normandy breakout. When the weather cleared and the Cubs went back up, the German advance stalled. At Dom Budgenbach, east of the Elsenborn Ridge, American divisional artillery from the 1st Infantry Division, with L-4 observers overhead again, fired 10,000 rounds in 8 hours to break repeated attacks by the 12th SS Panzer Division. The German assault waves walked into concentrations that found them in their assembly areas, on the approach routes, and in the attack positions. The guns knew where to fire because the Cubs were watching. At the Rhine crossing in March 1945, the 9th Army's preparation barrage involved 2,070 guns, firing over 65,000 rounds, a volume of fire that peaked at 1,000 rounds per minute. That weight of fire, coordinated across dozens of battalions and multiple corps artillery groups, depended on the aerial observation network that the L-4s provided. Ground observers alone could not have identified and prioritized the volume of targets on the German East Bank. The Cubs could. The last air combat involving an L-4 in Europe took place on April 11, 1945, near Dannenberg, about 100 miles west of Berlin. Lieutenants Duane Francis and William Martin of the 71st Armoured Field Artillery Battalion, 5th Armoured Division, were flying their L-4, named Miss Me, on a routine observation mission when they spotted a German Fieseler Storch below them. Francis pushed the nose down, Martin opened the cabin door, and both men emptied their M1911 45 caliber pistols at the German aircraft. The Storch caught a wingtip on the ground and cartwheeled. Francis landed beside the wreckage, and the 2 lieutenants pulled the wounded German crew out, bandaged the observer's injured foot, and handed both prisoners to a passing American tank column. It is the last air-to-air victory credited in the European theatre, and it was won by a fabric-covered airplane armed with 2 sidearms. What German senior officers said about American artillery after the war was consistent and crushing, even when they did not name the small airplane that directed it. Bayerlein's Cobra testimony has already been quoted at length. His broader judgment, recorded in the same foreign military studies manuscripts, was that the American combination of air power and massed concentrated artillery fire was unlike anything he had encountered in any theatre. He had served in Poland, in North Africa under Rommel, briefly on the Eastern Front, and in France. The American system, in his assessment, exceeded all of them in lethality, and the lethality came not from any single weapon, but from the coordination among weapons, the speed at which fire could be concentrated, and the accuracy with which targets were identified. Friedrich von Mellenthin, who served as a staff officer across multiple commands and fronts and reached the rank of Major General, published his memoir Panzer Battles in 1956. The book appeared in German and in English translation the same year, and has remained in print for nearly 7 decades. Mellenthin rated American infantry below British and German infantry in tactical proficiency, an assessment that was common among German officers of the period, and that tells us as much about German self-regard as about American capability. But Mellenthin returned again and again to the firepower that compensated for whatever he perceived as American infantry shortcomings. The American artillery and air forces, in his account, delivered a volume and precision of fire that made tactical comparisons between infantry formations nearly irrelevant. A division that might be outfought at the squad and platoon level could not be outfought when 48 guns fired a time on target barrage on any position that showed resistance. Mellenthin described German counterattacks in Lorraine in the autumn of 1944 being broken up before they could develop momentum, smashed by concentrated fires that arrived faster than his staff could adjust the attack axis. The observation aircraft were part of the system he was describing, even when he did not name them by type. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army during the Ardennes offensive of December 1944, described the failure of the German attack in his post-war writings with a focus on logistics rather than direct combat. Allied air forces, Manteuffel wrote, found worthwhile targets throughout the whole area of the offensive. Bomb carpets were laid on roads and railways behind the front, and the already inadequate German supply system was throttled. The mobility of German forces decreased steadily and rapidly. Manteuffel was describing the broader Allied air-ground system, from heavy bombers to fighter bombers to the observation aircraft that identified supply columns and gun positions. The L-4 was the lowest and most persistent element of that system, the one that arrived at dawn and was still circling at dusk, while the fighters and bombers came and went in waves. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West, attributed the Ardennes failure to what Omar Bradley, in his paraphrase of Rundstedt's post-war interrogation, called the tremendous tactical air power of the Allies and their massed artillery. The phrase is Bradley's wording, not necessarily Rundstedt's exact language, a documentary distinction that matters even when the substance is not in dispute. No senior German officer who wrote about the Western Front after the war disagreed with the diagnosis. American artillery, fed by American observation, coordinated through the Fire Direction Center, and delivered in time on target concentrations that no German formation could absorb, was the most effective killing arm the Americans possessed. George Patton, who understood the system from the commander's perspective, recorded a conversation with his French Army colleague General Cochlin-Schwartz in the Patton Papers, 1940 to 1945, edited by Martin Blumenson and published by Houghton Mifflin in 1972. Cochlin-Schwartz told Patton that the poorer the infantry, the more artillery it needs, and that American infantry needed all it could get. Patton did not dispute the observation. He wrote separately, in the same diary, that the war was largely won by the artillery. Major General Raymond O. Barton, who commanded the 4th Infantry Division from Utah Beach through the Hurtgen Forest, put it to his division artillery commander in even sharper terms after the war. The artillery was his strongest tool. It was often his only reserve. He repeatedly said it was more a matter of the infantry supporting the artillery than the artillery supporting the infantry. If this is the kind of material you want more of, the subscribe button is what brings the next document into your feed. There is no algorithm trick to it. You subscribe, the next one finds you. Then back to the record. Here is what the documented record confirms and what it does not, and a channel built on verified sources has an obligation to be honest about both. The operational reality that German batteries stopped firing or reduced their rate of fire when American observation aircraft were overhead is well established in the American institutional literature. Raines confirmed it in Eyes of the Artillery, the official Center of Military History account published in 2000. Kent Roberts Greenfield confirmed it in Army Ground Forces Study No. 35, prepared in 1948 under the title Army Ground Forces and the Air-Ground Battle Team including Organic Light Aviation, a document held at the Combined Arms Research Library at Fort Leavenworth. Carpenter's contemporaneous Stars and Stripes interview confirmed it from the field in language that cannot be mistaken. The operational logic was elementary and did not require a captured enemy document to verify. A muzzle flash visible from 1,000 feet gave the airborne observer a grid coordinate. That coordinate went by radio to the fire direction center. Within minutes, sometimes fewer, a time-on-target barrage arrived. For a battery commander who intended to see the next sunrise, silence was the only rational choice. What the record does not contain, as far as confirmed open-source research can determine, is a specific verbatim German order, a named German officer's memoir passage, or an identified prisoner of war interrogation transcript that says, in so many words, "We stopped firing when the American observation aircraft appeared overhead." Popular accounts of the L-4 sometimes attribute a colorful German nickname to the Grasshopper, or quote unnamed German prisoners, as saying that when the Cub flies over, all things cease. That line appears in dozens of books and articles about the L-4 and its legacy. It does not trace to a documented interrogation report, a named prisoner, a unit designation, a date, or an archival holding number. It is widely repeated. It is not sourced. On this channel, unsourced is not good enough. The German word Heuschrecke, which translates as grasshopper, appears in some modern German-language aviation writing about the L-4, but it is a back translation of the American Army nickname, which was coined by General Innis P. Swift during pre-war maneuvers at Fort Bliss in 1941. It was not a term German troops used in the field. The word Storch, meaning stork, referred only to the German Fiesler observation aircraft. The nickname Maytag Messerschmitt, a joke about the sound of the small Continental engine, was an American and British quip that circulated among Allied troops, not a German expression. Surviving German wartime documents that reference American light observation aircraft use generic operational language, Feindlicher, Artilleriebeobachter, meaning enemy artillery observer, Aufklärungsflugzeug, meaning reconnaissance aircraft. No documented German nickname for the Piper Cub has been located. This gap is not evidence that the phenomenon was imaginary. It is evidence that the specific German language documentation has not yet surfaced in digitized or publicly accessible form. The most likely places to find verbatim German testimony on the subject are the Foreign Military Studies manuscripts in National Archives Record Group 549, particularly Mellenthin's manuscript A999 covering Army Group G operations from September through November 1944, and the subject manuscripts P023 on observation and reconnaissance, and P038 on American radio intelligence and security, none of which has been fully transcribed into searchable digital format. The British Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Centre transcripts at the National Archives at Kew, filed in the W0208 series, contain thousands of pages of secretly recorded conversations between captured German generals and senior officers held at Trent Park and Latimer House. Those men did not know they were being recorded. If a Wehrmacht general ever told a fellow prisoner, in what he believed was a private conversation, that the American observation aircraft had paralyzed his artillery and made it impossible to fire without being destroyed, it is likely in those files. They have not been fully digitized. The research invitation remains open. The gap itself tells us something about how the German officer class processed the American artillery system. Senior German generals, the men who wrote the memoirs and the post-war manuscripts, described what American firepower did to their formations. They described the results in detail. They described the volume, the accuracy, the coordination. What they did not do, or did not bother to do, was explain the mechanism. For an officer trained in the German system, in which artillery observation was the province of forward observers on the ground and the occasional Storch sortie, the idea that the entire American fire direction network was being fed by men in fabric-covered training aircraft may not have registered as something worth documenting. The airplane was too small, too slow, too primitive to warrant a place in a general officer's operational narrative. It looked like a toy. The fire it directed was not a toy. The disconnection between what the L-4 looked like and what it could summon may be precisely why so few German memoirs mention it by name or type. The generals described the shells. They did not describe the 65-horsepower airplane that told the shells where to go. Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein surrendered to American forces in the spring of 1945. He spent the next several years in custody, and then cooperating with the Foreign Military Studies program at Allendorf, writing the manuscripts that documented what his division had experienced in Normandy and the Ardennes. He was released in the late 1940s and lived quietly in West Germany. He died in Würzburg on January 30, 1966. His manuscripts on Panzer Lehr, a 902 and a 903, are held in the National Archives at College Park, Maryland, in Record Group 549. They have been cited by Rick Atkinson in The Guns at Last Light, by Carlo d'Este in Decision in Normandy, by Martin Blumenson in Breakout and Pursuit, and by virtually every serious historian who has written about Operation Cobra and the Normandy breakout. The passage about innumerable guns of American artillery pouring drumfire into his positions has entered the permanent American understanding of what happened on July 25, 1944. Bayerlein described what the American artillery did. He never identified the airplane that told those guns where to shoot. The spotter overhead was apparently too small and too ordinary to warrant mention in a general officer's memoir. Friedrich von Mellenthin died on June 28, 1997. Panzer Battles has been in continuous print for nearly 7 decades and remains one of the most widely read German staff officer accounts of the war. Modern historians, including Robert Citino and Wolfram Wetter, have placed it within a broader tradition of post-war German general staff memoirs that emphasize Allied material superiority while understating the German command's own strategic and moral failures. That caveat applies to Mellenthin's evaluations of American forces. His observations about the weight and coordination of American artillery, however, are operationally consistent with every other German account from the Western Front. They have not been seriously challenged on the facts. Hasso von Manteuffel died on September 24, 1978. He served briefly in the West German Bundestag in the 1950s before a conviction related to a wartime incident involving the execution of a subordinate. His post-war writings on the Ardennes are held in the Foreign Military Studies collection and have been cited by Hugh Cole in the Ardennes, by John Toland, and by Anthony Beevor. Major Charles Carpenter returned to Urbana, Illinois, after the war and resumed teaching high school history. He did not seek attention for what he had done in France. He rarely discussed his service publicly. When local newspapers occasionally ran anniversary pieces about the town's wartime veterans, Carpenter gave brief, modest interviews and deflected attention to the men he had served alongside. The contrast between the man who strapped bazookas to a training aircraft and flew it at German armor and the quiet schoolteacher who came home and graded papers for the next 2 decades is one of those details the archive preserves without explaining. He died on September 26, 1966, in the same year as Bayerlein. Rosie the Rocketer, the L-4H he flew over Lorraine with 6 bazookas strapped to its wings, survived the war and entered civilian service under Austrian and then Swiss registrations. It flew for decades as a civilian sport aircraft, its military history unrecognized, until aviation historians identified it and traced its serial number in 2017. The aircraft was recovered, restored, and is preserved today in flying condition at the American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Massachusetts, where it is displayed alongside the armor it once hunted. The Foreign Military Studies program that produced Bayerlein's manuscripts and so many of the German accounts cited in this narrative continued at various sites into the late 1950s, producing more than 2,500 manuscripts by German officers on topics ranging from individual battles to army-level operations to assessments of Allied weapons and tactics. The manuscripts vary enormously in quality and honesty. Some are careful operational accounts grounded in war diaries the officers had access to. Others are self-serving narratives written by men who understood they were writing for an American audience and adjusted their accounts accordingly. Bayerlein's Cobra manuscripts fall on the more credible end of that spectrum, because the destruction of Panzer Lehr was so total and so well documented from the American side that there was little room for invention. The artillery he described, the observation network that fed it, and the silence it imposed on his own guns are facts the American record corroborates. The L-4 Grasshopper cost $2,432 in 1942. A single time-on-target barrage called from its rear seat could destroy a gun position that German engineers had taken weeks to prepare and camouflage. The German answer, when it came, was not a new weapon, not a tactical innovation, not a technological breakthrough. It was silence. Battery crews sat in their pits with loaded tubes, clear targets, and orders to fire, and they did not fire, because firing was a death sentence delivered by an airplane their own training manuals would have classified as a primary flight trainer. The most feared aircraft on the Western Front carried no ordnance, no armor, no instruments worth naming, and no speed. It carried a radio and a man who could read a map, and on the other end of that radio frequency sat a fire direction center that could deliver more explosive per minute than a squadron of heavy bombers. If this material matters to you, a like helps it find the people who care about the record over the legend. Subscribe and the next document arrives. The men who faced American artillery in the Second World War left thousands of pages describing what it did to them. The small airplane that told those guns where to shoot barely registers in the German documentary record, not because the Germans failed to notice it, but because they filed it the way a man files the weather. It was always there. It was overhead at dawn, overhead at noon, still overhead at dusk. And when it was overhead, the guns fell silent, not by directive, but by the accumulated knowledge of what happened to the last battery that fired when the Cub was watching. The documents survived. The silence is in them.